From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Today, I'm with Mary Roach, who is the author of 6 books about science. Her topics have included human digestion, the human cadaver, and humans in outer space. Her newest book, Grunt, looks at the curious science of humans at war. The book includes Vintage Roach, boundless curiosity, and infectious enthusiasm, all written with a delightful sense of humor, and there are, of course, lots of maggots throughout the book. One reviewer likened her to the perfect dinner guest, rolling out one surprising story after another, and I found that to be very true reading this one and reading her previous books. Grunt isn't a look at the ballistics of war or the raw power of nuclear bombs, what you might think of as military science. Her book, like all her other books, is a study primarily of the human body. And she says, "I'm interested in the parts no one makes movies about, not the killing, but the keeping alive." Mary, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So, as I've said, you've written about space and sex and the human body and why the science of humans at war.
Well, it's a topic that I got interested in a kind of unusual way. I was reporting a Smithsonian magazine piece on the world's hottest chili peppers. I was in India, and while I was there, somebody said, "Oh, the Indian Defense Ministry took these chili peppers and made a non-lethal weapon, kind of essentially a pepper spray, but in a powder bomb." And I thought, well, I need to report on that. So I went over to the Indian Defense Ministry's lab, and I spent a day kind of poking around as I do, and they were working on that. They had been working on a leech repellent, which fascinated me, and I thought that at that point I just realized that military science is a little broader and more esoteric than I had thought, and it just planted a seed that this might be a sort of roachable territory, as it were. And then when I got home, I happened to be corresponding with a retired Army pathologist who had, I think he'd read Stiff, I'm guessing, and I said, I'm sort of thinking about military science, but I think access would be a problem. What do you think? And he said, I think you should try it. And he introduced me to people at the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System at Walter Reed, and he really sort of opened some doors and encouraged me to run with it, which I did.
And was the military pretty responsive in having you poke around?
They were surprisingly receptive to it. It was a lot of times, it took a year to get, I spent some time on a ballistic missile submarine out at sea. That took about a year to set up, not because people were saying no, but because nobody knew who's the person to say yes. So it would be like you'd start with you'd have the submarine group, and then the naval operations person, and so I would get approval all the way up at the top, and then we had to find who wants to be the submarine captain who goes, yeah, she can come on my boat, So that took some doing. So, but people at the Department of Defense were, I think they were. These are stories that don't get told, and they're positive stories. They're stories about scientists who are trying to make this very difficult experience of serving in the military, in combat, trying to make it a little more bearable and safer. So it's a story that I think they were happy to tell. So it was surprisingly, they were very helpful, in fact. I mean, they didn't have a chance to vet the manuscript. It wasn't that sort of like, well, we'll let you in, but in return we have to see the manuscript. They had no real input. They didn't really know what I was doing, except in a very general sense. Yeah.
So one of the interesting things I learned in the book is it's not just about keeping a soldier alive, but it's also ensuring that they have a decent quality of life if they have an injury or what have you. And if I can just read just 2 sentences. The long-term quality of a soldier or a Marine's life is a relatively new consideration. In the past, military decision makers have concerned themselves more with go, no go. Do the injuries keep a soldier from contemplating her mission? Have we lost another pawn in the game? Do you have any examples of ways that they're trying to improve the life of a soldier?
Well, the whole book is,
Right.
I mean, there's everything from, heat injury and heat stroke, which in recent conflicts has been a big issue, to diarrhea, which people tend to think of it's kind of a tee-hee topic. Historically speaking, I mean, this was, you look at conflicts like the Mexican War of 1848, 7 deaths from dysentery and disease to 1 combat death. In recent years, with improvements in sanitation, you don't have the same situation where there's like sort of a mess tent set up right next to a field latrine and flies going back and forth and no refrigeration, and hundreds of troops getting sick with things like typhoid fever and dysentery and dying. So now we don't have that, but we still, in like the special operations forces who are still out in remote areas eating, they're not on the base where it's very sanitized, so there's a very, very high food poisoning rates. So just all manner of things that you don't necessarily think about as risks of combat. These are the things that I look at in the book.
And you said at some point in the book that the cost of, combating food poisoning could be as much as the cost of combating post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, no, they were talking about something, it's called their post-infectious consequences of severe food poisoning, irritable bowel, and there's something called reactive arthritis. So that you have a 5-fold greater increase of developing after you've had a severe case of food poisoning. So, and that's the VA will cover benefits for that. So the diarrhea person, the diarrhea expert that I spoke to, his feeling was that could rival expenditures, what is spent on PTSD. So it is, definitely just a bigger problem, and not one that sort of is obvious to people when they think about serving in the military.
And am I correct in recalling that, and if I am, this is a real eye-opening fact when I read the book, that a cholera patient could discharge 5 gallons of effluent?
Yeah, that's the statistic that I heard. I mean, so much so that and there's a Navy Captain Phillips who, I forget which year exactly, but one of his contributions, among others, was the invention of something called the cholera cot, which is a cot with a hole right here and a bucket, just because you can't keep changing the bed quickly enough. And that's why it's so fatal. You just dehydrate so quickly. So yeah.
And let's get to the maggots. I know I brought it up in the introduction. They found that, interestingly, that a maggot can be used to clean a wound.
Yeah, this was a World War I discovery. There was a surgeon with the French Expeditionary Forces who was seeing patients. A few patients had come in who'd been out in the bush in the field for a few days, coming in with big wounds that had been infested with maggots. And of course, the natural response is to get those out of there, a fear that they're going to promote infection. And what Dr. Baer kept seeing over and over in these patients, in these soldiers, was that when they took away the maggots, there was this fresh, pink, healthy tissue coming in, and there was no infection, which ran counter to what one would expect. And he noticed this over and over, and in fact, 10 years later in civilian life, decided to try that with some cases of stubborn infections that weren't responding to normal treatment. And in fact, they do work really well, because what a maggot does is it just performs a natural debridement. That debridement is taking away the dead tissue to prevent infection and encourage the growth of new tissue, so that maggots, as we all know, they like dead stuff. So by putting them in there, and there's a dosage for maggot therapy. Maggot therapy is still done today. You need a prescription.
It has a Medicare billing code.
Yes, there's a Medicare reimbursement code and a dosage, and they put something called a cage dressing. So you have this little community there on your leg or your foot. It's often diabetic patients with foot ulcers that are difficult to treat. And you would think that it's a very disturbing, upsetting thing to have maggots feeding upon you in any capacity. But in fact, if you have that kind of infection that is not going away, and here's a possible treatment, you welcome it, to the extent that some of the folks who have been patients of maggot therapy, they have T-shirts that the company, Medical Maggots, has T-shirts that say "Maggots on board." So people kind of proclaim to the world, and in fact, they kind of get involved in this little community. And they're not, because they're when you put them in, they're kind of the size of a cupcake sprinkle. They're tiny. They're not the big, fat, kind of squirmy Halloween horror story maggot that we're used to envisioning. They're small, and they all they go head down into the wound. They actually immerse themselves and feed in that way. So their butts are sticking. They actually breathe through their ass. Among the maggots, many charms. It's an ass breather. So they're all kind of, they're just the little butts are sticking up. Kind of reminded me of on an accordion, all the array of buttons. Just these little kind of squirmy buttons. So it isn't quite, I envision this this sort of like the thing you see in a gross out movie, but it's not really like that. Anyway.
And I told you this is like our
sorry.
favorite part of Mary. So what happens if one of these maggots inadvertently turns into a fly? I mean, it wouldn't be an inadvertent; it's its natural course. But what if it flies around the hospital?
That's one of the reasons it's been a bit of an uphill battle for advocates of maggot therapy. Trying to introduce. What is the maggot sign?
That's the maggot sign.
Thank you. Because what a maggot is just a feeding machine, and it wants to eat enough to prepare itself to go off for its very sci-fi journey, where it's going to go off pupate and become a fly. So you have to remove them after a couple of days, because you don't want them trying to leave the wound and go pupate, because then you have flies in your hospital. That's the last thing that you want. So it's maggot therapy. Maggots are cheap, but you need nursing staff to change them, to change the cage dressing, to make sure they're not left in too long to the point where they're all trying to go off and hide and pupate and become flies. Yeah.
And you, I guess, in the course of your research, had looked at that the Office of Strategic Service was looking at using flies as a weapon of war in southern Morocco, I believe?
The OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA, Stanley Lovell, who is the head of research, an imaginative fellow, had this idea that, because they were trying to, this was in North Africa, there was a region in Spanish Morocco, it was called, and they were trying to stop the Nazis from heading in and cutting off supply line. Anyway, his idea was to create a simulated, there were a lot of goats in the area, create a simulated goat dung that would be spiked with pathogens. The flies would then land on the simulated goat dung, pick up the pathogens, and go land on the Nazis' food, inoculate the food or the Nazis directly with these pathogens, and thereby covertly destroy these groups of Nazis who were there. So that was the idea. It was called Operation Capricious. It never, because it's sort of play on Capricorn, goat.
Mm-hmm. Oh, right.
A little obscure. They never deployed the special dung. And this was the best part. They were going to drop the dung from airplanes in the middle of the night. And he said in his memoir, I figured there's so much dung around no one would really notice. I think you notice when someone's dropping goat dung in the middle of the night. I think that's not normal.
Or it falls on your tent.
Yes, Anyway, but it was an idea that that's as far as it went. I think it went probably about as far as a cocktail napkin, yeah.
But looking through the dung and the flies, you did find a product called Who, Me?
Who, Me? Yeah. This was another fanciful Stanley Lovell idea, and this one was actually 2 years were spent on this. This is again World War II, and it was an idea that Lovell stole from the Brits. The Brits had something called stench liquid, and what this was, it was meant to be a cheap, small, covertly deployed tube or atomizer of hideous stink, and this would be distributed to motivated citizens saboteurs, who would then, when they spotted a Japanese or a Nazi officer, sidle up and deploy this, and it was treated like a weapon. There was like it was supposed to have a range of 10 feet. There could be no backfire, obviously. The British one actually had a compound that would delay the onset of the stench so that the operator could disappear before the stench hit. So it was a lot of thinking, and 2 years of work, and some big fat files in the OSS archives were dedicated to this. SAC-23 was the technical term. Who-me was the nickname that Stanley Lovell gave it. The idea being it was supposed to just smell like, this is his words, not Mary Roach's, a very loose bowel movement. So the idea was to humiliate and destroy morale, and just every little bit helps in these war efforts. So thus began this highly entertaining, to me anyway, back and forth of letters between the Arthur Little Chemical Company, who were trying to come up with an odor that was not only repellent, but universally in all cultures would be considered repellent, and just a little bit weird, so that it was unidentifiable. They wanted like a mix, not entirely the loose BM, but something added to it so that it would be scary as well as hideous. So that's what you want with a malodorant, and those are still the things that more recently the military has funded, crowd dispersal, that kind of thing. So you want it to be foreign smelling, so somebody goes, I don't know what that is, and it's freaking me out, I'm going to leave. So it's got to be not only foul, but a little bit confusing, unidentifiable, and scary. So there was, the back and forth, and then the testing began, and they were testing it in like tropical conditions and Arctic conditions, and it had to be, the tubes would have to withstand a certain amount of drop force, and then they would be delivered to the people who were testing them, and they'd show up, and half of them were leaking, and then they had a lot of problems with blowback and backfire and dribble. So a lot of angry letters back and forth between the people who had, commissioned these, both the stink and the deployment system. And in the end, Who-me, they produced a whole batch of it, and then 17 days later, after the final report on Who-me, the first bomb was dropped on the Japanese. So so the stink bomb never was deployed. Yeah.
But they also found that like a stench or a smell is not universal, and that it can also hinge on the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's right. I mean, if you take butyric acid, if you smell it in a deli, a cheese shop, if you sniff a piece of Parmesan cheese, that's butyric acid. It's also it's vomit, the smell of vomit. So depending on the context, it's it's kind of a pleasant cheesy smell, or it's a unpleasant vomit smell. It's all, and the Monell Chemical Senses Center, who's done some work more recently for the military on malodorants, for dispersing a mob or clearing a space, a compound or whatever. They in the 1990s traveled around with this woman, Pam Dalton, traveled around, and in her suitcase she had little bottles. She had vomit, sewage, burnt hair, and U.S. government standard bathroom malodor, and which was in fact the winner. This being a compound developed in World War II for testing latrine deodorants. You need a standardized, hideous latrine smell against which you try out your latrine deodorants. So this compound, this was the winner internationally, globally, culturally, because she would take these odors around and just presenting them to people out of context. Something like 3% of Caucasians found vomit to be a wearable scent, like a little, just a little. Sewage in many cultures, there was a percentage of people who thought, yeah, that's edible. I would eat that. So U.S. government standard bathroom malodor was the winner. What was interesting is that once you had that universally offensive and hideous smell, the subtlety here, which this is why you need the pros at the Monell Chemical Senses Center, they added a fruity floral top note, the top note being the first thing you get. So when you're exposed to a new smell, you are tentative, you take a little whiff, and that was the fruity floral. And then you're encouraged, because that's pleasant, to take a big keeper inhale. So on the keeper inhale, you would get this onslaught of this hideous smell. So that whole package is known as stench soup. And that is, I don't know where stench soup was deployed, and neither does Pam Dalton. She said, I gave them the formula. I don't know what they did with it. So somewhere out there, probably somebody's got a supply of stench soup. I myself had some that sat in my closet in a little vial for a long, long time, with, encased in activated charcoal, and I finally got the courage on the book tour to open it up, and there was a lot of fanfare, like, I'm going to open this up. It was at a big event, and I was going to, I thought of taking it to, no, never mind. I was getting.
Let's throw some out here.
So, but all of the scent had been absorbed into the activated carbon, and so it was this large anticlimactic moment. But I did smell some at Monell, and it is, that you do not open that without the fume hood, under the fume hood with the fans going, and it's pretty bad.
So I guess
I should have brought some. Can you imagine?
well, aren't you curious now?
Just a little spritz.
So one of the most life-changing injuries that you've discussed in the book are injuries to the penis and the male
Yes.
genitals. And this is, I guess, was kind of an awkward subject for a lot of people. I'm sure it was
Yes.
awkward for the military as well. But what are some of the improvements that they're making there?
Urogenital trauma is the more technical term, and it's become, in recent conflicts, it's become more of a problem for two reasons. One, the size of the bombs, the IEDs, they're bigger. So it's not like, a landmine you would tend to have, lost a limb, maybe to here, maybe here. And now these are bigger explosions going up to the pelvic region. And the other thing that's happened is that medical emergency trauma care in the field has become better and faster, so more men are surviving to have these injuries to the groin area, the penis. And so there's surgical. I was at at Walter Reed, where there was they were repairing the urethra of a young man who'd sustained such an injury, and it was fascinating in that I came into the operating room, and they put the blankets, the drapes, I guess they're called, surgical drapes, and normally they just leave the part that they're working on, and oddly they were up at his face, which I thought odd, but what they were doing, they take a rectangle of the inside of the cheek, because that's, first of all, it's hairless, and for a urethra you don't want there to be hair because minerals can collect on the hair, and you can end up with stones, and so you don't want hair. And you also want tissue that is going to be able to withstand a moist environment, and the inside of the cheek is that. So they took a little rectangle and they would roll it into a tube and use it basically to patch the urethra. And in that way, he would still be able to pee through his penis rather than, because if you can't do that, they thread it through the perineum. Perineum? It's a word I've often...
Read, but not heard.
Yes, read, but not heard. Anyway, the taint, I believe the taint is the more casual term. Anyway, they would have to thread the urethra, and you would, then he would have to sit down over the toilet to pee. And I had this conversation in the operating room with the surgeon and the assisting surgeon. The assisting surgeon was a woman, the surgeon was a man, and I said, how big a deal is that to have to pee, through the P word, the perineum, the taint. And he said, the surgeon said, well, given all of the other challenges of, losing a limb, et cetera, and I don't think it's that big a deal. And the woman turned to me, the assisting surgeon said, it's huge. So, so the surgery was, it did what it was supposed to do, and he's now able to urinate normally. And while I was there, the surgeon happened to mention something going on at Johns Hopkins, and this was about 2 years ago. I hadn't heard about that. He said, over at Johns Hopkins right now, there's a surgeon. They're doing what's called a wet run, which is using cadavers to work out the logistics of a penis transplant. And the first penis transplant was a few months ago. That was at Mass General, not Johns Hopkins. But I was able to see, and it was just fascinating. It was, they had two bodies, the recipient and the donor, and one circumcised and one not, which was interesting. They're dead, doesn't matter. Anyway, just to, they had this setup where they had an IV and a bag of dyed saline, dyed blue, and you could turn the stopcock, and they had hooked it up to a certain artery, and they could then see what region was perfused by this artery, and that would tell them, is this a critical artery to reattach? Is this an important one, and how much material do we take? You don't just lop it off like a tree. I mean, you got to take the roots. You got to take. Sorry. Anyway, I don't even remember what your question was.
This was 2 chapters.
But I was going to say, you had asked me what sorts of things are being done, and one of the things that I found interesting was that some of the surgical techniques, the reconstruction, not transplantation and not just repairing a urethra, but reconstruction, some of that is a collaboration between military surgeons and transgender surgeons. So that, you don't often sort of imagine the military and the transgender sort of communities getting together and helping each other. It was lovely, lovely.
So one more question on this, and then I'll move to underwear. Actually, I think I just forgot my question. So we'll move on to underwear. Why are silk underwear the best underwear to wear in a war zone?
Well, silk is surprisingly strong. It's very lightweight and strong, and so it's used to. It's not going to be bulletproof, but in terms of, people think of Kevlar. They think just that Kevlar, you could make a pair of underpants that would be bulletproof. But you need like 15 to 40 plies to be actually. Yeah, it's not going to be a comfortable pair of underpants. Silk is almost as protective. In terms of just a light layer, and it's not protecting against a bomb or a gunshot, but what it's protecting you against if there's an IED explosion. The tremendous amount, because these are buried bombs, so they are launching at very high speed, dirt, sand, debris, and a lot of pathogens. And what happens when an IED, you step on an IED or very near an IED, the tissue kind of blows out and the debris goes in, and then the tissue comes back, and you can just have horrendous recurring infection. So underwear, or not necessarily just for underwear, but it's very good. Whether it's silk or a few plies of Kevlar, it's keeping that material from penetrating. So there isn't any. So you used to read. There was a time when one of these companies was sort of marketing bomb-proof underwear, which, as the guy at Natick Labs, where they work on underwear, he said, if they can develop, if the insurgents can make a bomb that will flip a mine-resistant armored personnel carrier, they can certainly make a bomb that's going to blow up your underwear. So it's not bomb-proof, but it does help a lot in preventing infection. Yeah.
And when you're a combat medic, you're in a real high-stress situation, and a lot of us, our instinct's not to focus on one thing.
Right.
And you observed medics getting trained.
Yes. Yeah. The challenge, like you mentioned, if you're in a scenario where there's loud noises and people shooting, whether they're shooting at you or not, you have a burst of adrenaline and a fight or flight response. And what that does, it makes you fast, strong, and dumb is the way they describe it. It makes you able to run away, throw a big rock, whatever, just sort of brute strength. It does not help you focus, make good cognitive choices, operate delicate machinery, or cut an airway in somebody who's struggling to breathe, because what it does for you is the opposite of what you need. So combat medics and Navy corpsmen who provide medical care for the Marine Corps, they're trained at places like Strategic Operations, which is this old big movie studio near Camp Pendleton. The guy who owns it used to do action movies and war movies, so he's got a lot of technology for loud noises, pyrotechnics, and he employs actors to play injured people, including amputee actors. The day I was there was this amputee who had a sleeve over his leg, and it had been very artfully designed with gore, and it had a backpack with just the right amount of stage blood and a pump. It would pump, and so he could control the bleed in a realistic way. And depending on how the medic applied the tourniquet, could either be saved or die, and was acting, that role along with it, and screaming and making things as stressful as possible for this young man, so that he could practice doing care in a stressful environment. And the hope being, if you do it a few times in a safe environment and learn to cope with that and maintain your focus, hopefully you'll be a little better off when the real deal unfolds overseas. So that is part of the training. And it's fairly intensive. I mean, there were pyrotechnics. They had dust hits, so it looked like rifle fire was hitting the ground. And all the while, the instructors were sort of yelling and adding to the stress in that sort of boot camp Marine instructor way. So it was, not a pleasant day for those young men and women, but hopefully helpful for them in the long term.
So I'll ask one more question, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. But I guess the highest achievement in the science of war would be making war not lethal. Is there any chance of that happening?
Oh, well, if it's all not lethal to both sides or to one side.
I guess both. I guess if it's not lethal to one side, maybe it's not lethal to the other.
Well, then it's called diplomacy.
Well, that's true too. Good
and
point.
I'm all for that. I mean, there's a lot of course, moving toward using drones in place of boots on the ground, which is a policy issue. I didn't really write about that, but certainly that seems to be the direction that things are going. Yeah.
So let's turn it over to you. We have microphones to my right and to my left. And if you have any questions about this book or any of her previous books, get up and ask. I think we've got about 10 minutes left or so. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm a big fan. You tend to write a lot about subjects that people tend to be squeamish about. Do you have any techniques for getting people to talk about these in ways that they're more comfortable?
By that you mean the people that I'm interviewing, the researchers or scientists?
Yes.
Yeah. They tend to be squeamish topics. But if say you're someone who researches human sexual response, or in women in particular, having a conversation about the clitoris or about the amount of blood in the vaginal walls, that's just your day-to-day. That's not, so they're not at all squeamish, and for them it's like having a conversation about, tire rotation or something. It's not, there's no charge to the topic. It's actually very easy to step in and have a conversation with someone about their work, because for them it's just their job. So I don't really have any techniques other than just being very straightforward with them. Yeah.
Hi, I was interested, during your research, did you go out to Forest Glen, to the Museum of Military Medicine, to study any of the information that they have out there? And if so, what was your impression?
I did not. I years ago went to the AFIP museum where they have like the collection of bones and gunshot injuries and things like that. I don't know if I know that AFIP museum moved. I don't know if that's where it moved. Is that a separate?
That was the one that was at Walter Reed.
Yeah.
That's where it moved out to.
Yeah.
It's in a brand new building.
I haven't been, and I would love to. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
I love that you take one tiny topic and you go 10 miles deep with it, or 100 miles deep. Do you find that there's one core message in all of your books? What's the one story you're always telling?
If there's one core message, well, there are a couple of core. One is, I'm fascinated by the human body in extreme and unusual situations, and to me, I used to in my 20s do a lot of overseas just travel. I was just always looking to go to far-flung, and the more remote, the better. And at a certain point, I realized the human body is a foreign planet, and it's so interesting to explore, and I never get tired of it, and I still have so much to learn. So I enjoy sort of sharing the learning with my readers. So, I guess the other core is scientists are so smart, fun, cool, and interesting. And I guess I probably should have been one, but so being able to just knock on these doors and step into these worlds and find out what people are doing, and just the commitment and passion that they have for their work is endlessly inspiring. So over and over, that's what I encounter. Yeah.
Over here.
Hi.
Hi.
I have two thoughts. I want to try to tie them together because they're kind of related. So you mentioned when we first sat down, roachable territory, I think you said. So have you come across anything that you find is not roachable territory, or maybe something you're not willing to talk about? And kind of related, I know a lot of your books obviously are about the human experience, but you go into animal stuff. And for me, that's hard for me to read personally, so I've had to kind of like skip over some of that. Is there anything you won't talk about?
Oh, yes. Well, I would say 90-some% of science isn't particularly roachable because it's gone into the microscopic, it's molecular, it's genomic, it's not bodies on a slab, which is really my terrain. And so I'm really, it's a very small sliver of science in a way. I'm kind of a gateway drug to science. And a role that I love. I love when young people read the book, get excited about science, and think, I want to do science. And then, of course, there they are in molecular biology going, damn you, Mary Roach, this is hard. But fortunately, they keep going, and then they go to medical school, and they become researchers or doctors. So, but well, yes, I agree with you. The animal studies. I wouldn't, that is an interesting part of science. I know a friend of mine is an author, Rebecca Skloot, who wrote that book, Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. She's working on a book right now about, I don't know, maybe I wasn't supposed to reveal that. I didn't say that.
Spoiler alert.
But it has to do, because she used to be a veterinary technician, so it's about that whole world, and it makes sense for her to do that. I would be uncomfortable on a lot of levels. Also, my tone, I don't think, is appropriate, and yes, I agree with you. And the segments that you've skipped, those are when people write to me.
Glance over. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Skimmed. You skimmed them. Yeah. People will write to me and share that, not in an angry way, but say, I had trouble with that. You won't probably see me doing that as a topic. But,
Thanks.
Yeah.
To the left, sir.
Yes. On a related topic, what happens to those maggots after they've been used to clean the wound? And the same question goes for leeches.
Yeah. Oh, yes. After they're removed from the wound, they go to a maggot retirement community where they're cared for and lavished with lots of lovely dead food. No. Yeah, I don't know if they're taken outdoors to go pupate. Hopefully they are. And I think having the man who runs Medical Maggots has such a, after the book came out, he sent me this box with a little tube with alcohol and a bunch of little maggots in there as a gift for me. So he has I like to think that they are set free to become flies.
Okay.
So, but I'm not entirely sure that that's true.
So we've got time for one more question, and it will be yours.
Hey, pressure's on. Hello. So my question is, of all the scientists you've read about, of all the scientists you've met, who are a few who stand out to you as like unsung heroes?
Oh, well, just because we happen to be on maggots, George Peck, the maggot guy, trying to get the folks at Walter Reed to say, to see the value of this, because there are a lot of problems with infection. And just, this is a man who had me into his home, and he said, I've raised a clutch of maggots for you, so you can, and he came in, and this was at the dinner table, he had this little cut glass bowl, and I thought it was chocolate pudding, but it was raw liver, and there were these maggots, and he said, look at them, and look at those mandibles can do what no surgeon can, and he had this passion for maggots, and I just love people like that. Anyway, George Peck comes to mind, but there are dozens of them. Not maggots, scientists. Scientists that I love. Yeah.
Well, Mary, this was delightful. Thank you so much for
Thank
taking
you
the
so
time.
much. Thanks.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.